and welcome. Today I really want to talk about how to read poetry. And when I say how to read poetry, that might sound a little basic, hopefully not condescending. I definitely don't mean it to be condescending, like I have all the answers, but I think poetry is a very unique art form, and it can be difficult to know how to approach it. I think a lot of times people feel like they don't really get it, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today, like why we have to read poetry a little bit differently and what that actually looks like. How do you actually go into a poem? How do you approach it? What are the important things to be looking out for? So, with that said, I'm going to go through 3 things that I think trip people up when they're approaching poetry. So the first thing I want to talk about is theme/message. The second thing I'm going to talk about is line breaks. And the third thing I'm going to talk about is sound. So, first thing we're going to talk about is theme/message. So, I think when people go into poetry, a lot of times the way they get exposed to it is through like a high school English class. So maybe you had a teacher at some point who tried to get you to like extract the theme out of a poem and tell me, what is this poem about? What is this poem trying to say? There are lots of poems that try to say something. However, that is not always the intent of poetry. Not all poetry has an explicit message that needs to be pulled from it, that's just waiting for you to unpack it and get the theme out. Sometimes when people don't always quite get a poem right away, they think it's just they're missing something. Like, oh, I don't understand this because this is too complicated, I can't get what they're trying to say. Well, maybe they're trying to say something specific, but maybe they want you to feel something. Maybe they want you to just feel uncomfortable. Maybe they want to just introduce some cool imagery that is a little confusing and disorienting. Maybe they're trying to paint a picture for you or tell a story. Maybe they're not trying to get you to think about the implications of, the oppression of women or something like that. That is often the case in poetry, but it doesn't have to be. And that's what I want to talk about right now. So, the first poem I'm going to look at is from Poetry Magazine. Poetry Magazine is one of the oldest, I think it's the oldest running poetry publication. And for $36 a year, you can get poetry at your door every month, which I did for quite a while, and I love it. So the first poem I want to look at to kind of illustrate my point about poetry not always having this very specific message is this poem called Definitive Bright Morning. This is by a poet named Sai Hoa. Definitive Bright Morning. Noted to be the definitive bright morning of 10,000 calendars. The church bell melted. Rage of unrequited love became a terrible serpent. The morning star lowered like an enemy's flag. A vampire's mattress tumbled out at the outskirts of town. Ancient lanterns suddenly thrown through the air, somewhere deep in the mountains. That night, in a snowy, rural area, an elderly, powder-faced woman appeared on doorsteps in search of wine. Her origins neatly wrapped in the cold dressing of a snowflake's breath. Okay. I love this poem. It is beautiful, it is imagistic, it has a lot of interesting stuff going on, like a melting church bell, 10,000 calendars. It has this sort of mysterious powder-faced woman who comes to your doorstep looking for wine. However, when I read this, I'm not immediately struck by a message. I'm not immediately struck by a specific thing that the author is trying to say. We have the idea of unrequited love. That's probably our biggest clue. But if you don't immediately get this poem, it's not that you're doing something wrong. This poem is very shrouded in beautiful, interesting, kind of unsettling imagery. But I don't read this and think, I need to figure out what the theme is, and I need to figure out what the message is. What is the poet trying to say? As if all of this imagery is just a means to an end. Lots of times, poetry is just beautiful for the sake of itself. It's just beautiful for the sake of being beautiful. To kind of illustrate this a little bit more, I want you to take a look at this painting. This painting is beautiful. It's very colorful. It's kind of a little bit explosive maybe. But do you look at this painting and think to yourself, what message should I extract from this? Probably not. I mean, you could probably think of something, but that's not really the point, is it? The point is to enjoy its beauty and enjoy how it makes you feel. To me, it makes me feel a little bit excited almost because it's so colorful and explosive. But I don't sit here and feel like I need to extract this very specific theme. So I want to be clear, poetry can have very specific themes that it's trying to convey. But if you don't pick up on those things instantly, that doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. That doesn't mean you don't get it. It doesn't mean that poetry just isn't for you. So that's what I wanted to touch on first. I want to kind of set that right away. So the next thing I want to look at is line breaks. Line breaks are basically part of what makes a poem a poem. And they can definitely trip people up. So I think a lot of times, and I know I thought this too when I was first reading poetry, was that a line break means you get to the end of the line, you just take a very permanent, very big stop, as if it's a period. And I think part of the reason for that is because of the kinds of poems that people get exposed to when they're first getting introduced to poetry. A lot of times you're going to be reading stuff like Shakespeare, you're going to be reading stuff like romantic poems, romantic capital R, which is an era of poetry. So to illustrate this point, the poem I'm going to be reading is a poem published in 1794 from the book The Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience by William Blake. William Blake is a romantic poet, which means he comes from the romantic era of poetry, not that all of his poems are romantic, although lots of them are romantic. This is exactly what you think of when you think of a poem, typically. So this is a poem called My Pretty Rose Tree. And I want to be thinking, as we go through this poem, about the line breaks. How are these lines being divided? What are they doing there? My pretty rose tree. A flower was offered to me, such a flower as May never bore. But I said, I've a pretty rose tree, and I passed the flower o'er. Then I went to my pretty rose tree, to tend her by day and by night. But my rose turned away with jealousy, and her thorns were my only delight. So, just a quick overview of this poem. It's not a super complicated poem. It doesn't have a lot of very complicated words in it. It's a rhyming poem. We have these flowers in the poem. So we've got this beautiful flower of May that he's like, nope, actually I'm good. I've got a rose at home. And then when he gets home, he goes to tend to his tree and the tree's mad at him basically and is jealous of perhaps the fact that this other flower wanted him. So this is probably about a lover being jealous. That's sort of a little bit of the implication there. But I want to really focus and dig into these line breaks. So at the end of the first line, we have a me, and then the third line, but I said I have a pretty rose tree, so we've got the tree, and then we've also got bower and ower. And then in the next stanza we have tree, jealousy, and then we have night and delight. So already right off the bat you have these very strict rhymes. You have these lines that are about the same length. All of them are pretty similar, you can see it. And then you've got these strict rhymes that are sort of breaking up the poem a little bit. But then to add to that, you have actual punctuation at the end of every single line. So you've got a comma after me in the first line. You've got a comma after tree in the third line. In the second line, you have a semicolon, which is an even bigger stop than a comma because it's kind of like a period. And then at the end of the stanza, you have a period. And then that is repeated in the second stanza. I know this is super, super in the weeds. It's super technical, but I just want to show the way that this poem is encouraging you to read it with stops at the end of lines. And because a lot of times this kind of poetry is what people get exposed to, is this sort of older poetry with stricter form, stricter rhyme, and stricter structure, I think going on, we carry that with us and we think, oh, that's just how you read poetry. Just like with messages, where a poem can have a message, but it doesn't have to. With line breaks, you can read a poem like that, or you could not, depending on the point of the poem or the way the poem's written. So I'm gonna go through an example of this that is totally different, where the line breaks are clearly not designed to be read in this extremely strict way. So one of my absolute favorites poets of all time is a poet named Bridget Pegeen Kelly. She is a poet laureate, I think. This book particularly was published in 1995. Absolutely fantastic collection. This is one of the books that really got me into poetry. So I'm gonna look at a poem she wrote called Field Song. And we're not gonna read the entire poem, I'm only gonna read part of it, I will spare you. Even looking at it on the page, you can see that it's laid out very differently. It has these really, really short lines. It has these very short stanzas. They're kind of crunched together a little bit. And they're all three, and then they're kind of indented. So it looks kind of interesting on the page, almost like it's flowing a little bit. So I'm gonna read this poem. Field Song. What stands? The walnut. The tower of story dark with crows. The leafy way station for doomsayers. Say nigh, say no. Say the morning comes in with a silver spoon, and the silver spoon rattles in a cup because the child is gone. But still the child stands, the way a statue does in the mind or in a field, a fawn figure with a filigreed grin. There beside the walnut and the way of passing things, the wide road down the middle of it all. The middle ground gives way, and we are on the other side, as in a game. You're it, you're not, you're out. Arms up. God, I love her poems. She's just, yeah. Kind of what I said with that first one. We don't have this very explicit message. It's very imagistic. It's very, it's a lot. That's the best way I can describe it. This poem is just a lot. There's a lot to unpack with it, but I'm gonna talk very specifically about the line breaks because if I don't stop myself, I will talk forever about it. So as you can see, this doesn't have punctuation at the end of every single line. If I were to read this poem with just a stop at the end of every line, it would feel weird. It would just feel awkward because that's not what it's doing and that's not how it's structured. There's no one way to read these line breaks, but to me, when I read these kinds of line breaks, I read them as like a half a pause, like an almost comma, basically. Not such a stop that it feels like an end point, but enough that it kind of breaks the poem a bit. It sort of slows me down when I'm reading it, and it causes me to think of the lines and the content of each line as a little bit more isolated. So I'm gonna show you a really good example of this in that third stanza. So this stanza starts with, "Say the morning comes in with a silver spoon, and the spoon rattles in a cup because the child is gone." Each of these lines that I just read introduces a new image. So we have "say the morning comes in." We didn't have a morning before, now we've got a morning. With a silver spoon. Silver spoon is a new thing. We haven't seen that before. That's a new image. And the spoon rattles. Now the spoon is rattling. Okay, that's a whole new thing. In a cup because, so in a cup, now it's in a cup because the child is gone and now there's a child. So in 5 lines, in 5 very short lines, we have 5 new images. Breaking up these images creates this kind of slower, but also kind of more relentless structure. Like it's new thing, new thing, new thing, new thing. If she were to put spoon rattles in a cup, we wouldn't read spoon rattles first and then in a cup. We would just read it as spoon rattles in a cup and you would just see that. I did the example of using a picture before, but in this case, kind of imagine looking at, instead of a picture that is just on the wall where you can see everything, this one is very much almost like the line breaks serve as little coverings. So each line, you're kind of peeling back a new layer of the picture. Okay, I'm gonna peel this back. Now I see a new part of it. Oh, I'm peeling another piece. Oh, I see a new thing. This sort of ability for line breaks to sort of slow you down but give you like a little bit of whiplash by introducing new image, new image, new image is a super masterful thing in this poem, and it's a really interesting use of line breaks. All that to say, you do not have to read a line break as a stop. It is not just a full stop reading. It can be a lot of things. It can be used for emphasis, it can be used to slow you down, it can be used to make images more relentless and just to keep you moving, essentially. So to sum it up, line breaks can be used in very different ways, and they don't all have to be you just stop at the end of the line. The last thing I kind of want to talk about is sound. Poetry really, more than anything, comes out of oral tradition. It comes from song, it comes from stories. Even for poems where visuals serve an important piece, sound is extremely important. And the biggest advice, if you are starting out with poetry, that I can possibly give you is to just try reading it out loud. It's amazing how much more comes out of it. I even hadn't read all of these poems out loud before, and I'm learning and hearing new things as I do. When you have the visual and the auditory together, it can really unlock new things and help you understand more. So to talk about sound, I'm going to do the master of sound himself, a person you may have heard of, and if you haven't, I highly recommend him, is a wonderful man named Langston Hughes. This is a collection of his poems. It's the selected poems of Langston Hughes, and these were actually assembled by him, which is not very common. Usually if you have like a collection of best poems, it's not actually by the author, like it's made years later by an editor or whatever. But Langston Hughes at the end of his life actually put together a collection of his best poems, and this collection is phenomenal. So Langston Hughes was part of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, and he wrote poems that were very inspired by blues and jazz music. And that is super obvious and clear in his poetry. So I'm just gonna start with this poem called Note on Commercial Theater. You've taken my blues and gone. You sing 'em on Broadway, and you sing 'em in Hollywood Bowl, and you mixed 'em up with symphonies, and you fixed 'em so they don't sound like me. Yep, you done taken my blues and gone. You also took my spirituals and gone. You put me in Macbeth and Carmen Jones and all kinds of swing mikados, and in everything but what sounds, and in everything but what's about me. But someday somebody'll stand up and sing about me, and write about me, black and beautiful, and sing about me, and put on plays about me. I reckon it'll be me myself. Yes, it'll be me. love this poem. I feel like that's just gonna be a thing I do, is every poem I read, I just say how much I love it, but it's okay. You're gonna have to live with it. So this isn't an extremely complex poem. It's not hard to understand what he's saying. He's talking a lot about whitewashing. He's talking a lot about blues and jazz and black music being taken and appropriated and whitewashed. But I want to talk specifically about one moment in this poem. In the second stanza, where it says, "You put me in Macbeth." So where it says, "You put me in Macbeth and Carmen Jones and all kinds of swing Mikados." So we've got those rhymes going. You could almost see a version of this poem that doesn't change, but instead kind of keeps going. You put me in Macbeth and Carmen Jones and all kinds of swing Mikados, and you put me in this, and you put me in this, and you put me in this. He could kind of keep going off, but he doesn't. He cuts it off, and he says, "And in everything but what's about me." So you've got gone, which is not exactly a rhyme, but it's a little bit of a rhyme. So you've got gone, Jones, dose, me, and that really kind of harsh E sound. And he then goes on and on with the me and the me and the me, which he interrupts with black and beautiful as like a kind of that pretty alliteration to like catch your ear. But that moment when he breaks off his rhyme, it catches your attention. It kind of makes you stop because it subverts your expectations a little bit. And then he uses that to kind of put the focus back on himself about what he's going to do and how he's going to make a name for himself, even if other people are going to steal from him. That's the beauty of what sound can do for you, and that's a thing that you just don't get as much by just reading it on the page. You really benefit from reading his poems out loud and hearing them read, or listening to someone read them. You can do a lot with sound in a poem, and it's going to be reflected all across the art form. To sum that up, I just wanted to take a moment today to kind of show the basics. The things that really kind of trip people up and the things that can really help you if you can work through them. So just to sort of summarize, poem doesn't always have to have this very specific meaning. Line breaks are not something that have to be read as like a stop and therefore make you confused when you're reading. And reading out loud is really gonna help you do it. And if you don't wanna read out loud, come over here and I'll read it out loud for you. I'll read you a bedtime story. I'll read you bedtime poems. I'm so down for that. I don't know, I feel like listening to people read is very relaxing. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you consider these. I am gonna do a thing where I start putting all the poems or artists that I reference in a video in the description so that if you are interested in any of the poems, you know where to find them. I appreciate you. Thank you for being here, and have a delightful day.